Around half of all Jews in Israel identify as secular. They are generally not anti-tradition. They simply don't want their Jewishness defined for them by outside authorities, i.e., rabbis. They don't see tradition as a binding halachic framework, and so they shun the religious establishment and many religious practices. Many secular Israelis find themselves in conflict with Judaism in the sense of the religious establishment. On the other hand, it is clear from their behavior that they are in harmony with Judaism in the sense of the comfortable observance of customs and traditions without compulsion or coercion. Secular Israelis observe many Jewish practices and rituals. Secular boys celebrate bar mitzvahs and even read from the Torah. Secular girls celebrate bat mitzvahs, but far fewer read from the Torah. Secular Israelis do not don tefillin every day, nor do they recite blessings before eating. But on Yom Kippur, many of them fast. They also light candles on Hanukkah, even if not every night. They dress up in costumes to go to Purim parties. They celebrate the Passover Seder. Most dip apples in honey on Rosh Hashanah. Israeli secularism is generally a Jewish secularism.
Hello and welcome. My name is Shmuel Rosner and I'm a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute. Our guest today is Professor Aviad Kleinberg. He is the head of the School of History at Tel Aviv University, also an author of a recent book, Don't Search for It in English. It came out only in Hebrew, A Guide to the Secular. So hello, Professor, and thank you for coming.
Hi, Shmuel. I think the English title is A Guide for the Non-Believer.
A Guide to the Non-Believer. Okay, so let's begin here. What's the difference between the secular and the non-believer in the Israeli context?
I think for me, secularity, or laïcité, as they call it in France, is basically a political and a social term. It has nothing to do with whether you believe in a higher entity, or if you believe in that the Big Bang means that there is a creator to the universe. It means basically that you are for the total and strict separation of church and state, and then you're against any form or kind of oppression, if you want, or any attempt to enforce religious or non-religious ideologies on the public sphere. So in that sense, you can be secular, as far as I'm concerned, and not be an atheist. You can be secular and believe in higher power. You could be a deist, as far as I'm concerned. You're secular.
You're a historian, but you also live here. So when you look at Israeli, what we call Israeli chilonim,
right,
which is usually translated to seculars, are these chilonim seculars or non-believers?
I think it's really, so most people don't. It's the funny thing. I once had this conversation with a friend of mine who was talking about the way to talk properly about the Holocaust. And I said, both my parents are Holocaust survivors, and they obviously did not take your course, and they don't speak properly about the Holocaust, unfortunately. So I think in some ways most seculars in Israel don't have a very clear and well-worked theory. They don't, what they see themselves as doing, what they see themselves as in some ways living is obeying religious authorities or not obeying religious authorities, and more specifically, whether some of them do obey some of the commandments, the so-called the mitzvot, but whether this is part of a whole or it's part of their own choice. They decide that they want to eat shrimp, but they don't want to eat pork. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is Israeli secularity. It didn't start that way. It started as something much more belligerent. But I think I would say, from my point of view, nowadays, I would say most people who I would consider secular would define themselves as traditional, whatever that means. Basically, it means nothing. It means that they're not obeying any specific, they don't have a rebbe. This does not mean that they necessarily don't eat kosher. They do not fast on Yom Kippur, or they don't do Kiddush. They
But,
don't
but
have a rabbi.
in many other parts of the world, being secular means you don't even have a religion, and then people might think that being or feeling Jewish and being secular, there's a contradiction here. This is not the case in Israel, right?
Well, I don't think it's the case in Judaism. Judaism makes everything much more complicated because it's not just a set of religious dogmata. It's not just you cannot be a secular Catholic. You're either secular or Catholic. You cannot be a Catholic atheist. You're either a Catholic or an atheist or a Muslim or whatever you are. You can't be a Jewish atheist. In fact, some of my best friends are Jewish atheists. So in that sense, I mean, we have that thing, which I think for most Israelis is the most critical aspect of their Jewishness, which is their identity. That if you want to use I don't know, a sociological term, it's the ethnic identity. This ethnic identity includes certain aspects that are taken from religion, but they do not obey rabbis. They do not necessarily believe in the 13 principles of Maimonides. Most of them don't even know that these 13 principles exist.
Right.
And even less that have ever read them. Nevertheless, if you say, so you're an atheist and you don't have anything to do with Judaism, they will cringe because when I write in my book, I mean, I think I'm pretty close to being an atheist. Nevertheless, I circumcised my 2 boys. So obviously, the difference, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, this seems to be an irrational thing to do if you don't believe that the God of Israel has commanded you to sort of do this for Him. Why do you do this? Obviously, this is just a way of maiming, if you want your newborns. But the thing is that for me, it's a way of saying I'm part of a certain identity. This identity did not arise yesterday. Some of these things, as far as I'm concerned, may be strange and even ridiculous. It's sort of marriage ceremonies, burial ceremonies, and circumcisions. Nevertheless, I think that some of them, or a certain nucleus of them, is important for me, for my identity.
You wrote a book, you wrote a guide, or you called it a guide. It's not really a guide.
It's ironic.
Yeah, you called it a guide. If someone needs a guide, that means that someone is somewhat lost.
Yeah. I think
are Israeli seculars lost, or non-believers, are they lost?
I think it's true and not true. I think in some ways I'm not part of this the lachrymose attitude to Jewish secularity. If you look at I'm quoting Salo Baron, his idea of Jewish history. It says from one Yahrzeit to another. So in that sense, there's always, some people are always mourning the good old days, which were not that old, and we're not that good, and we're not necessarily even more secular than what we have today. So in that sense, I don't think that the Israeli secularism is under threat. In fact, if anything, I think that Israeli religion, or at least parts of it, are under a major crisis, especially because crisis occurs when you have something that you believe very strongly in, whereas most seculars don't believe in anything very strongly. So there are no crises in that sense. On the other hand, I think the religious language in Israel, the religious discourse in Israel, is rife with religious and anti-religious ideas. And when they have to confront people who are, sort of chovshei kippot, or wearing yarmulkes, and have been brought up in institutions where part of the upbringing was debating, discussing, convincing, they quite often feel that the only thing they have is that they don't want others to tell them what to do. So I thought in that sense, it's important to tell them, look, it's not just that. I mean, it's not that you don't have, that it's commitment to ideology or to ideas and to values on the one hand, and simple, sort of a tendency or simple craving for shrimps on the other. There is, and has been in the West, a long tradition of criticism and critique of religion, and I'm telling you some of it. But as I say in the beginning, I think for most people, the question of whether God exists in the strict sense of the word, whether you can prove his existence or disprove his existence, is of absolutely no importance. This is true for religious as well.
So this goes back to the famous story of the loaded wagon and the empty wagon.
The little camel, as you know.
It's a camel in the Talmud, but then it became a wagon.
It became a wagon. I think it's not.
Cultural.
I think it's a mythical. Well, it's one of those mythological stories. As far as Ben Gurion,
for those who aren't familiar with the story,
so Ben Gurion,
let's retell the story.
Ben Gurion is meeting the Chazon Ish, Rabbi Karelitz, who is the sort of a Lithuanian rabbi and one of the leaders of the Haredi community in Israel. And the Chazon Ish is telling Ben Gurion, who's then prime minister. I will refer to that quickly. He's not just prime minister; he is the Messiah. He is the Messiah.
He's the founding father
He's
of
not
a
just
nation.
the founding father. It is what they're doing is deeply religious in their way of thinking. They're not just true. I mean, he is eating pork and he's driving on the Sabbath, but what he's doing is something deeply religious. And I think in some ways the Chazon Ish realizes that and is threatened by that. And the Chazon Ish says, look, the Holocaust has finished all our yeshivas and all our sort of religious academies, and you have to allow some people, to get off the military service. I mean, they're talking at first a few hundreds of people. And it is true. The Holocaust has left, sort of desolation, utter desolation. So this whole world, which was fairly big, not as big as it is in Israel, but big, has disappeared. And Ben Gurion says, why should I do that? I mean, everybody should do the same, blah, blah, blah. And he says, when there is a bridge and you have a loaded camel and a camel, a loaded wagon and a wagon which is unloaded, then the unloaded wagon that is easier to maneuver has to give way to the loaded wagon. And he says, the loaded wagon is our wagon. The echt Jewish, sort of the Jewish wagon. I mean, we have the Shas and the Poskim, we have everything, we have the Yiddishkeit. And what do you have? I mean, basically, it have to be two things. I mean, Ben Gurion is not convinced by that, even for a minute. I mean, he thinks that he is history. He is Jewish history. He's not. I mean, it's something. It's funny. I read this one of Amos Oz's early articles, and he was speaking, and Oz was saying, we had a state. It was led by someone who was hearing voices. Ben Gurion was hearing voices. He was not hearing the voices of God. He was hearing the voices of history in one way or another. So Ben Gurion was absolutely sure that he is history. And this guy and the guys that he represents are on the
past,
way.
or the Jewish past.
It's not just the past; they're on the way to to the dustbin of history, as Lenin was saying. You could devote effort to sort of destroying them, and he could do that if he really wanted to. But why? I mean, it will happen of itself. So let it move on. And as I said again, I want to emphasize that point. This is not, I mean, Ben Gurion is not secular in the real sense. Ben Gurion is a religious person. He does not believe in the mitzvot. But he is building the third temple, Habayit HaShlishi. He is part of making, making of Herzl, Eliyahu Hanavi. He is the precursor. He is telling us what Ben Gurion, David, he is the Messiah.
So tell me, when did Israeli secularism stop being religious? If it was so religious in the founding
67.
years, 67. That's
yes,
the year.
it's funny because you assume it's the other way around, right? Instinctively, you would say 67. Everybody becomes very religious. I think in some ways, yes, it's true. Everybody becomes very religious, but the seculars stop being religious. Because as far as they're concerned, I mean, it's all the aspirations, all the dreams have been fulfilled. I would say it's not true. Maybe saying 67 is inaccurate. I should say 67 and 73. 73, the moment when the founding fathers, who have never been wrong about anything from the beginning, everybody's been wrong. The rabbis were wrong. The rabbi said, let's stay in Europe. Everything will be okay. There were great powers. They were really, Jabotinsky. Everybody was wrong. They were always right, one moment after another. In 48, Ben Gurion says, we're doing a state now. So he says, it's out of your mind. It's completely crazy. They've always been right. 67, complete victory. 73, everything is gone. And I think not everything is gone. But I mean, I think in some ways, this feeling of divine providence, this feeling that we have a role to fulfill, that we are not just the Messiah's donkey, as sometimes the religious were referring to the seculars. So this very Cookian idea that we are the Messiah in a way. That I think was finished. And after that, I mean, we're just like everybody else, and we're everybody else, and we're threatened, we're too threatened, I think, by by symptoms or by sort of all this Yiddishkeit, which I think should not threaten us. I think what it is, as I told you, Shmuel, on another occasion, it's not so much Yiddishkeit. I think it's Reitishkeit. It's being more and more right wing. It's using Judaism to make it something that it has never been.
So the real dividing line is not between people who believe or disbelieve. It's not between people who practice more or don't practice as much. The dividing line is purely political.
Well, I think these things have. Well, in Israel, it's unfortunately. I mean, it did start like that. Unfortunately, there is a correlation. I mean, we had for a while that the most religious people in Israel, the Haredi, were also the most left-wing. But that is finished. They're very right-wing now.
Today they are the most right-wing.
They are the most right-wing. So everything is very coherent. If you're secular, you're left. If you're religious, you're right.
Referring to your guide, what are the things that need to be fixed in Israeli secularism that isn't really secularism society? What needs to be done?
What needs to be done is very, very simple. It has been, and the idea has been, if you want to look at the great moment of the rise of the West, it's a separation of church and state.
So separation, what in the American model, you will not teach
Absolutely
no Bible
Yes.
teaching at schools?
Well, that's a good question. Should we never teach Bible? I think that Israel found a good compromise, because the way the Bible is taught in Israeli schools is basically not as a religious text,
Right.
not
as
as
a literature,
It's
cultural.
it's like for a Greek in the ancient world, what made you Greek was that you believed not in a religious way, that you thought that the most important sort of identity creator was Homer. And that in some ways you found yourself in the Iliad or the Odyssey. One of those names, you said, this is us. Okay, that's been quite often.
So what do you do in a
But
in Israeli school
No,
before
yeah.
Yom Kippur, before Rosh Hashanah? You don't say anything? There's a holiday coming.
Yeah, you don't say anything in school. You don't say anything in school. You say enough. I mean, it's part of our heritage. These things are being said. Yes, they're being said in the media. They're being said in newspapers. They're being said by individuals. But it's not part of the teaching that you teach people in school. A, B. If people want to eat, they're allowed to eat, and it's none of your business what they do. And if they want to see, Netflix in Yom Kippur, you allow them to see Netflix and it's none of your bloody business what they do. Yeah. So I think in that way, my assumption is, A, that it will take a while until this vision will happen. B, that this involves...
It will take a while, meaning you believe this will eventually happen?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it will eventually happen. It will eventually happen. Well, not in the way... I mean, you portray it in black and white colors.
Right, that's true.
It's not either nothing or everything.
So you're calling for maintaining in some way the uniqueness
A
of
secularized
Jewish culture
secular-
without religion?
Absolutely. Yes. So I'm saying, yes, the Bible, that's why I pause, because I think the Bible is very important. But yes, talk about Jewish heritage, do teach Jewish history, do teach people that some of those... I think that you should teach parts of the Talmud too, not just the Bible, well, the Mikra, the Bible, it's a Christian name. Yes, not just the Mikra or the Tanakh, but because this is part of our heritage. On the other hand, no missionary work whatsoever in schools. And today there's too much of that. I don't think it's very effective, quite frankly. But people are attempting to do this, and I just don't see why? And also, I mean, there's so much money wasted on religious establishment that is basically servicing people who don't want it. I mean, most of the rabbanut, the local rabbis, the city rabbis, all of that are servicing people who would rather do without them. The church, as I said, did not disappear when it was depoliticized. It became more spiritual. It did not lose its timber. And in some ways, it cleaned itself. And I think it should happen to us as well. It should happen quicker because everything is more traumatic and everything is the pace is much faster now. But I don't think in any way, as I said, that Judaism not only is Judaism not going to disappear. It's even Jewish religion is going to recover. Shmuel, I'm looking at some of the things that are the people who are representing my religion or my heritage. And I'm saying this Chilul Hashem Gadol, because you're looking at the way, that the sort of compromises they're doing for their politics. And the result is that people like me and my children are looking and saying, and I don't think that should happen. There should be very, sort of this American saying, sort of good neighbors make good fences make good neighbors. There should be a very good fence, and then we can be very good neighbors.
Since we are speaking mostly to Americans or to outsiders, to non-Israelis, I would like to conclude with two questions referring to our specific audience. So the first one is, will such vision work only in Israel, or you think Jewish secularism or Jewish, whatever name you call it, can thrive in other places as well?
That many, one of the fears that people present to us is the fear of assimilation. But one of the interesting things that we realize in the United States is that people who intermarry, for example, don't necessarily want to sort of forget their Jewish roots. In fact, many of them would prefer would consider themselves Jewish, would want their children to be Jewish. I think in some ways, if we realize that the main thing is identity, that identity has certain aspects that are ritualistic. I don't think that ritual is not important. Ritual is important. Certain aspects of it are ritualistic that I think, but it is much more flexible than it is now, and that it is, as it should be, it is one of the decisions that communities are making and not leaders who in some ways, and this is a new thing, define themselves as being inspired by the Holy Ghost. As the Da'at Torah, this idea that they're inspired by the Holy Ghost, and they're infallible, like the Pope. I mean, the whole idea that Jews, for many years, the Jews argued about everything, and all of a sudden we forgot to argue. This too was one of the motivations of writing that book. I don't know how successful it was, that we should argue instead of curse. And sort of turn our backs to each other. Well, we'll see. I mean, it's new, so maybe we can argue more.
Second questions,
yes.
Referring to our audience. Many people look at Israel from afar, and they are afraid that Israel is becoming a theocracy or is becoming, quote unquote, like Iran or such other things because of the dominance or the visibility of religiosity and religious leaders in Israel. Do you have any way?
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. But I think that's not the only threat that we have to fear. I think Israel could and is becoming more and more right wing. So it is more ethnocratic. It is more indifferent to ideas that were extremely important to many of us, the rights of man, the equality, and so there's a debate on that. It's not clear, but I think there's a real threat that aspect, fortified by religious ideas, because Jewish religion, like other monotheistic religions, is patriarchal. It's very conservative. It does not believe in equality. So in that sense, it's very useful. It's very handy. It's like Trump does not believe in anything, but he likes evangelicals because why not? I mean, they seem to be willing to do whatever he says, no matter who he is. So I think that is That is the real threat. That kind of collaboration, which is the collaboration, of interest. These are joint interests. They're not deep common.
Not joint theology.
Not
It's
joint theologies, but that combination, that conjunction, I think, can be very dangerous. And I think this is one of the things that we need to fear, and one of the things that we need to fight against.
Professor Kleinberg, thank you for coming.